Добрый день, уважаемые гости.
Good afternoon, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is so good seeing a full house here, because after the spectacular developments of yesterday, which have followed on today and will continue to be unfolding, we had some apprehensions that the climate issues would be backstaged by ongoing political change. There's been so much interesting and spectacular in yesterday's address to the Federal Assembly. Yesterday, the President mentioned the problems we are prepared to talk about now, and he mentioned that Russia is prepared to work together in an active fashion with international partners on the improvement of the environmental agenda. There were so many other topics touched on by the President, but this one was very pertinent to our today's discussion. It's so good that the organizers responded well to the initiative of a group of enthusiasts, because we were supported by Andrei Fursenko, who is going to catch up with us in a few minutes, because he is opening another event in this building. So the climate policy, and I want to emphasize the word policy, because we are not engaged in the climate science issues, because there's just one person who is a climate science person. Others are politicians, and it appears that the climate discussion has entered a new phase. For many years, we have witnessed ongoing debates on the causes of the global warming. This is something that was not put to the front of the political agenda. Climate now is truly a political issue, and that means that this agenda will render an impact on the policies pursued by other countries, irrespective of the scientific discussion on the topic. This is a fact of life. And the talented Greta Thunberg, just by appearing out of the blue, has put the discussion in a new context, a new genre, showbiz-oriented politics. Luckily or unluckily, this question will be paramount for the climate agenda. A whole number of countries, particularly in the European Union, and compelled many partners, the green parties, the environmental parties, or whatever they are called, have become sprouting everywhere. And when Germany will elect the Green or the Environmental Council, and this is a matter of time, nothing else, the entire political agenda will be dramatically changed. This will be an intellectual, cultural, and a political development. Well, of course, we cannot cover everything in an hour and a half or even less than that. So we have a motley collection of speakers and panelists today. I cannot promise you another Greta Thunberg, but I can promise you a collection of panelists who know exactly what they're talking about. I believe that politics should stem from tangible facts in life, so I'd like to pass the floor on to Vladimir Katsov, who is the chief of the geophysical laboratory of the Roshydromet of Russia. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Fyodor. Indeed, I will use the word politics once or maybe twice by the end of it. I would like to start with some pictures. And pictures may be helpful in trying to grasp what I have in mind. Yesterday was the 15th of January. 15th of January was the day when the World Economic Forum published a new report, the 2020 report, a report compiled by a collection of experts who define global risks for the global economy mainly. These risks are arranged here in two dimensions, by their probability and by the scope of their impact. And risks come from different sources. The green ones are environmental risks, which include climate risks. More than green, well, some water-related risks are also related to climate. For you to understand this readily. Right, okay. Let me demonstrate the recent 4 years to you. In terms of first category, probability-wise, the extreme weather conditions take the top of the list for 4 years in a row. When it comes for the impact, the climate issues are now ranked at the very top, shoving aside weapons of mass destruction. And this is a very recent set of data. Well, I'm not advertising it, but I'm just indicating the source of this data. When it comes to global warming, this picture is a summary of the 5 world meteorological centers, and they track the fluctuation of temperature in the world. Well, these data are compiled following sophisticated methods and looks impressive for those who realize that the average global temperature is fairly sustainable characteristic. So whenever you say that not above 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees or something like that, whenever you hear something like that, is that we have already selected our target data for the post-industrial period, and we measure that as compared to the second half of the 19th century. I don't think you can see the other part of the chart, and it actually demonstrates the growth of the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. And whatever is on the right-hand side is the unprecedented growth of the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere over the past 8,000 years, or a couple of thousand years at least. 400,000 particles per million is yet another indicative target. Back in the 2015, we achieved 408 particles per million ppm, and this happened over a minute period of time in the lifetime of humanity. When it comes to the Russian Meteo Service and how this compares to world development, starting with the 70s of last century, well, the warming has been there. The Earth has been warming up at a rate of 0.18 degrees a year, and we can understand that the land is warming faster than the ocean, whereas Russia has been warming at a rate of 0.47 degrees per year, which is faster than elsewhere, particularly when it comes to the Arctic territories in the Russian Federation. They've been warming at a rate of 0.69 degrees. I have no chance whatsoever to reasonably display the workings of the climate science, which gives an outlook for the future change. And the research community publishes several reports on the climate change, on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, back in 2013. And now the sixth report is already in the pipeline. In a nutshell, we are following climate changes. We are coming up with new hypotheses, and we translate them into mathematical models. And something which consumes a lot of research resources. And then we would offer an outlook based on our observations. Then, having gained confidence or lack of confidence in our models, we can start talking about what awaits us in the future. And, well, the Meteo Center of the Roshydromet is also a source of various papers or reports which are available widely. Well, these are thick papers, thick reports consisting of thousands of pages. And so you can superficially thumb through some of them if you are curious. So, proceeding from what I have just referred to, or proceeded from, so let's ask several questions. Is the chemical composition of the atmosphere changing? And is economic activity of man responsible for that at all? So, with a high probability, we can give an affirmative answer to yes, this is true. Climatic changes is a medical fact, kinda, because it is based on observations. We are also in for a certain consistent trend based on these charts. Well, these are several scenarios of the human impact on the world climate. Well, the red scenario is the adverse scenario, and the blue scenario is more mitigated, it's more mild scenario, but it is more questionable. So starting with the beginning of the 21st century, differences between these two scenarios result in monumental changes in scenarios and their projected results. So hence the clouds around the central curve. Climatic changes are also related with the anthropogeneous impact, with human impact, so to speak, solar activity, volcanic eruptions, and the inner fluctuations of the world's climate. The previous picture, I demonstrated the change of the global temperature on land and in the ocean. This is something which can be safely projected by all models. Right. Here's another interesting thing, the total area of the sea ice. The black curve shows that the ice area in September fluctuated over the past years, and it was reducing. And, well, two scenarios for the future. Well, the lowest rate of decline of the ice area is 12.9% over a decade. And this data is based on the 2015 observations. Then, based on the scenario we choose, we can say that the Arctic region will be ice-free in summertime, of course, not in winter. And economically, this is fraught with problems as well as benefits. By the way, I will also mention a little later some of the benefits resulting from the global warming. However, this is fraught with a lot of problems for our country, as there's so much permafrost in this country. and the depletion of permafrost is fraught with many a problem, as indicated by the pictures below. And here's the most interesting thing here. And we are talking about the high impact of weather and climatic conditions that are fraught with devastation and damage, including the loss of human lives. And the Munich agency, insurance agency, publishes statistics on natural calamities fraught with various kind of damages. And the red bars on this chart are those accidents that are not related to climate. Everything else, the blue bars and the green bars, are climate related. I have no time to provide a comment on every component of this trend because there are so many various incidents and there are so many kinds of accidents which are involved in this picture, but it is quite illustrative, indicative. Since this system is based on a lot of inertia, we include in our statistic developments of the past decades, and starting with the second half of the 21st century, 21st. And the world community has come to believe that we are doomed to certain developments. Therefore, in Paris, the latest Paris Agreement is focused on the adaptation to the inevitable. Before, we were focused on mitigation, reduction of emissions, whatever. Now, our climate doctrine, adopted back in 2009, ran ahead of the world trends, and this adaptation was covered avidly in the Russian doctrine. Finally, when we talk about the importance of adaptation, we need to realize that to get adapted, we need some quantitative assessments, and they are difficult to obtain. Well, this is something which demonstrates climate change in this country related to floods, to other natural calamities which could be foreseen. And what are the adaptation tools? If we're talking about sophisticated models that help us project future natural calamities or climate changes, I already mentioned that well, this takes a lot of computer resources to come up with these models. We are blessed or doomed with vast territories, with diverse climate, and many other things. But I don't think we are fully competitive internationally in terms of computer resources. Well, we have just 3 of them. That is it. Well, we are ranked in 465 in terms of the 500 top computer used. Well, the Lomonosov is one, and the old glory of the Roshydromet computer, which is very close to the end of the top 500 ratings. There's this Burbank computer, which is very promising indeed, and hopefully the climate scientists will be able to make use of it. I don't really have any time left, and while the climate issues can be treated in different manners, we may take an approach offered by Alexander Herzen and others, like what's to be done and who's to blame. Well, the Herzen approach is very, very clear. So I just wanted to imply that. So, however, when it comes to what's to be done,
apart from the adaptation that I already mentioned, of course, here we see a vast vast opportunities for various political decisions, and I think you will pick up on that topic. Thank you. Thank you very much for your concise but at the same time informative presentation of the problem. When it comes to political decisions, I think especially in our state, but not only in our state, we usually go for the Herzen approach. We look for who is to blame, and then we think what to do. But that was in the past. I hope that it will be different in the future with the new government, yes, and with the new constitutional system. Now I would like to draw your attention to one important thing that Vladimir mentioned. In fact, we already are talking about adaptation, and I think it is very rational. Indeed, even if we take to action, we are not omnipotent. We cannot do anything, and I think that indeed experts are going to be talking about adaptation, but politicians that are to sell those decisions to the public, they will be talking about saving. They will be trying to save situation and sell that idea to the public. Sorry, I forgot to mention one thing. In the end of December, we adopted the National Adaptation Plan. First 3 years are preliminary years of preparation. And I just wanted to mention that right now we have a regulation, a framework strategy in place. Well, okay, that is a specific action. I was talking about the overall environment. I think that very often we take these things simplistically, and those speeches like that of Greta Thunberg, that kind of voices will be dominating. Now, very often politics right now is a range of PR tricks, but at the same time, those actions, they have to nevertheless rely on solid knowledge. Oleg Valerievich has been dealing with the climate matters for a long time, even before Greta Thunberg, so now it's over to you. Thank you. Indeed, when we see that Oxford English Dictionary marked climate emergency as the phrase of the year, so now indeed we need to discuss what to do with that. Today in the morning, during business breakfast organized by Vadim Kovalchuk in another building, we had a presentation by Jeffrey Sachs. And with all the conviction that he usually speaks with, he, in the same way, today he said that we have nowhere to go, and of course the US is the biggest sinner considering the position of President Trump, but he said that Russia is going to be the second sinner because because of everything you do in terms of oil, and we are all doomed. We can either look at the worst predictions that are in that matter, or think about what we can do about it. So it looks like our agenda is clear. However, Greta spoke about the European agenda. Trump presented the American version of agenda, and nevertheless, California keeps going on its way without looking at what Mr. Trump was saying. There is a universal agenda, and there are geopolitical strategies of specific countries or blocks or groups of countries that are trying to take advantage of that common agenda, or they are trying to interpret it their way and customize the universal agenda to their interests. So what can Russia do about all those problems that were announced by Jeffrey in the morning or Greta? Well, as a response action, we can first, for example, look at what is happening in Russia or to Russia. For instance, we know that in our country we have a lot of stations that measure various meteorological parameters. But in Russia, there is no network like that organized by our science foundations in the US that is engaged in critical zones observance. There is a similar network in France, Moscow. This model was then copied by China with investing a lot of money into it. What it provides is a complex monitoring of situations. Why critical zones? This term was coined by geochemists, American geochemists, when they were trying to obtain financing for a new type of works to prevent eroding of rocks. So critical zones appeared there, and then it was popularized. So basically, usually there is a thin layer of inhabited by humans. It's 2 kilometers below Earth and 2 kilometers above Earth. All those various places, rivers, seas, air, and other zones were assessed against various parameters. And of course, from those stations, we receive various information on various parameters. And as of today, unfortunately, in Russia, there is no integrated system or network that would present a picture on what is happening in Russia. Vladimir said that we lack computers in order to calculate and process data, but in my opinion, there is no data to put into those big computers. If we look at this situation, then what do we have? What can we say about it? Well, first of all, if we look at France, in fact, this year we have this dialogue on Trianon, and they're going to hold various research works on climate, and we will see how that goes. How can we cooperate in that matter with them? But we also understand that in Russia we can only move on by means of looking many times and one at the same thing. When Mr. Putin says that in the Arctic the temperature rose, he just repeats, in fact, what has been said many times already before that, and we can look at that very parameter in various ways. If we look at this zone, in fact, all the works that we are seeing now, they were invented by in the works of Professor Vernadsky. In the Institut du Globe in France, the textbook by Vernadsky was written, and you can still find it in their library. And by that, I mean that we already have that knowledge. We are basically sitting on that knowledge, and very often we do not understand the richness of the knowledge and data that we already have. Thank you. Vladimir Zelensky recently said that Vladimir Vernadsky is a Ukrainian scientist, so he has arguments to oppose to what you are saying. Okay, Oleg has just quoted Jeffrey Sachs, and his presentation was made in the Western style, if I may, with the self-criticism. In fact, the methodology of what he presented is quite common. Right now, Russia is blamed very often, and sometimes there are solid arguments standing behind it, sometimes no. And the second variant becomes more and more often. Sometimes we look at how to measure and focus more on what methodology we apply, and we do not look at the results. So I know that our next speaker is very much concerned about the methodology we apply and the results as well. Thank you. Yesterday, China said that they are going to introduce the carbon tax before the end of July. Carbon tax is a recent novel of many economies. It means that a person has to pay for the carbon footprint this person produces. Could you please put on my slides? Or, for example, if this person sequestrated or somehow took CO2 out of the atmosphere, this person is entitled to some compensation. And many countries have already implemented this kind of tax. This program has been tackled seriously by Canadians, and every ton of CO2 there, for example, costs approximately 25 Canadian dollars. What does it mean? In the scale of the global economy, it means, for example, that if we produced wheat 1 ton of wheat, if we export it to Nigeria, we can ask for that 1 ton of wheat $240. We advertise that wheat and we say that it's very good. But then, in the modern world, the society can look at our fields and say that we have produced that much of CO2 producing the wheat. We haven't sown the land properly, and we used fertilizer that uses nitrogen, and that nitrogen penetrated into soil. And it means that your wheat, in fact, costs $380. In front of you see a scheme of how we can measure and assess that sequestration potential of agriculture or even anyone, any person. In our days, we know there's been created a software that is called CALM, and it monitors power station to assess their carbon footprint, environmental footprint. At the same time, there are 450 various companies that manage those power stations. But I will park that comment and explain later why I mentioned it at all. So the question is how we can measure what happened on that land. For example, how can we assess whether the agriculture, in fact, used land in a good way and produced something, or maybe wrong technologies and methodology was used and harm was done to the environment. If, for example, our satellites are equipped with hyperspectral cameras, we can use spectral analysis and see what is happening on Earth, whether we can understand whether atmosphere is suffering or not. So we can use satellites and we can observe clouds and winds. Then we can use various flying devices. We can equip them with sensors and analyze the environment and some locations from there. Then we can equip our agricultural machinery with various sensors and again use that data for analyzing. So in this way we gather big amounts of data and then we put in that data into a model. For that we need software, computers, big data technology, but anyway that machine produces a verdict. You are a sequestrator or you are emittent. You are to be paid or you have to pay. And that is important. Here we basically make money out of air because an analogy of that process is crypto mining. Because here what we do, we gather data from trillions of sensors and from that we make money. Those models, who calculate those models? Who manage satellites? Who controls parameters of hyperspectral satellites? That Karma software that can monetize its control over 450 power stations. Who controls that software? Is there a political or economical input in there? There is some input from economy and politics anywhere. Because we think that we are going away from those famous questions, who's to blame and what to do. We are talking about man-made impact on the environment, but in fact that topic is also abused in order to take advantage of the situation. So the question is, who is the client of that situation? Who are we? We are subjects or clients? Do we have an input in those models? Do we have our satellite groups? Do we have technological resources to develop those models? Can we protect those models? Can we prove that they are valid? Can we mine the money? Those are very important political matters. We are very much in the thinking that Russia, with the vast fields and forests, that we are a blessing for the planet. Just like Brazil, we are sequestrators. But in fact, people with their models and with their satellites, they are in the position to say that, oh no, you're emittents. In fact, you only help the planet during the summer time, but during winter, in fact, you do the opposite, and that is why you are to pay. So you are not the lungs of the planet, you are kidneys or liver or some other not very pleasant organ. So we see a very important technical task in front of us. If we are going to play this game, if we are not going to wait what will be the bill for every Russian power station or every agriculture, we need to go for technology. We are talking about satellites and drones, and right now we see that the global atmosphere will be totally controlled. The Europeans are going to launch hundreds of satellites in order to measure various greenhouse gases. The main one is steam, but then methane, nitrogen oxides and others. Where we are in that model, we are going to get the final figure from some important public body. Are we going to just take that information and live by it, or maybe we will go ahead and measure that information ourselves? What will be our role in the game? Do you think that it's right to take that information from someone? I think we should do that, otherwise we'll be losing.
This is a very urgent matter. We don't have any time left. Thank you. Thank you. So whenever people start talking about karma, they begin living in another world. Well, look, I believe that we have touched upon a monumental issue, a gigantic issue, and still it is part of the prevailing international trend of colliding. Well, local approaches collide with global approaches. A few years ago, people thought that everything is becoming global. On the other hand, and at the same time, there is a growing trend at fragmentation. And who decides? Well, a few years ago, people were saying that everybody should decide, all should decide. It's valid no more. Because there is a chance of a discussion, and still it is getting slim. And Mr. Konov, chairman of the board, Sibur Holding, we scared ourselves and everyone else with this new existential protectionism. However, when it comes to climate, politicians will say, so what about the business community? So what are you doing in favor of better climate change? And now, the business community may become a target for all political spheres aiming at protectionism, reducing competition. Are you ready? So when we met before this meeting, they said that eggheads will start about how hard it is, and then the industry, the business community will step in and say what it is. So this narrow-headed industry, narrow-headed, highbrow, lowbrow industry is us. Let me say what we think about all this and then what we should be doing about it. Well, there are greenhouse gases. And these gases, particularly carbon dioxide, have a tendency of accumulating. So it has been accumulating and accumulating, and it will keep on accumulating. And Paris agreements say that they will try prevent raising annual temperature increases by more than 1.5 degrees. And then high cost considerations come into play, and we have to think of how to prevent from injecting new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and then try to removing it from the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide has been accumulating. And by the year 2050, we'll need to achieve the zero effect of the CO2 to absorb. And now sequestration is the new fashionable world. So the simplest way of sequestration, what everybody has in mind, is to plant a lot of greens. So if you think airlines, like PPB, something that it is difficult to eliminate is that by the year 2050, we will reduce our emissions by half, and then we'll plant many more green trees. So fuel companies are saying the same. So everybody's going to plant a lot of trees, and this is the first response. Then there will be no more land left on Earth because everything will be covered by green trees. And that will be another way of dealing with carbon dioxide. So, well, they sequester more carbon dioxide than they emit. Suriname is covered by trees by 93%. It has very incipient industry. So I believe we shall keep a little more industry than that. So it's either industry or forests. So do you hope for what? We do. And I kept notes here and was thinking about some climate control and our strategies. The first compliance is to observe national regulations. If you take a look at all companies, municipalities, and regions, which should not be associated with countries, so 16% of all emissions in municipalities and regions are in compliance. Well, there are Paris target figures, there are plans, there are some quantifiable results, there's a national agenda, there are national obligations. And Russia is not yet part of that regime. So Japan, in my understanding, is in the mode that we might think of doing something by the end of the 21st century when we are technologically capable of that. So Japan is not part of the Paris regime. We are not part of the Paris regime either. Not in the sense of Suriname or Sweden. So we, as a company which operates in Russia alone, or almost only in Russia, we need to comply with the Russian legislation. The second thing that our highbrow colleague told us is the sufficiency for a competitive edge on the world market. I sincerely hope that Sweden, which has 130 times greater carbon tax than in China, for instance, will, after some time, introduce that carbon anti-dumping practice, with a carbon footprint may be higher in some country than in Sweden. Then, being a Swedish citizen, I will think this way. If someone's poisoning me by emitting carbon dioxide in their country and then sells the country, they will owe me because I have to limit CO2 emissions. And I believe this anti-dumping will come into being in a short while. This may be part of the carbon tracking on the world scale, and this is a trend which we keep track of. We're trying to reduce our footprint because we realize that after a while we'll have to pay for it. Well, there's some other imaginary idea, one's own convictions or location of one's assets or our faith in shareholders, each company. So if investment funds say we do not invest in industry with high carbon footprints, and if they stop investing in us, or then again, we reduce our carbon footprint. It's either or. Well, there are some companies like tobacco industry. No one invests in the tobacco industry, but some shareholders which popped up 20 years ago are still there. No new shareholders. What about new trends, recent trends in more specific strategic agendas? So what's going to happen? First, materials are going to be replaced. Say, we are producing materials. The IT industry, those who produce polymers, steel, mortar, concrete, everything. We are responsible for 23% of the global emission of carbon dioxide, if we trust international sources. So we're responsible for 23%. The steel industry is responsible for 30 to 35% of our output. What consumers expect from us is they want us reduce the product design. More carbon-emitting materials will be replaced by less carbon-emitting materials. And the sharing economy, which is sharing a certain asset. So if no one's buying a car of their own, people would choose to call a taxi whenever they have to go someplace rather than buying a car, or they will share a car. This is going to be a trend for both economic and environmental reasons. Recycling or reuse. Instead of manufacturing one product that will then be discarded, that would create a material that can be reused again and again, like in chemistry. And the entire chemical industry is investing heavily into the design of these new materials. I further believe, and this is my personal opinion as a citizen, as a company official, and in 5 or 10 years' time, there will be not so much synthetic materials unless there is a regulatory requirement to recycle and keep recycling. And this is a good thing, environmental-wise and economical-wise. Well, there are some decisions which are made at a regulator level. Say, public transport instead of personal or private transport. This is substantial change for the better in terms of the carbon footprint and renewable energy sources as compared to carbon energy sources. Although we are a country which is not readily suitable for this kind of strategy, it will be in place here too, because all other companies around us are under the requirement of this climate agenda, and they're all moving towards renewable energy. Well, planting green trees is complemented by renewable energy sources, and we do offer renewable energy to our consumers. Construction, another huge, immense industry. Retrofit buildings, which are actually adapted to consuming less energy, or use of new materials in construction that would require less energy and hence a smaller carbon footprint. This is also important, and this is something that will be changing at a faster rate than everything else. As regards whether Russia will be leaning heavily on these new environmentally friendly industries, will that be done in a voluntary way or not? I believe that after a while, this will be matched by government efforts, and the government will be requiring that we make these kind of decisions, because this will result in reduced carbon footprints. Thank you. Thank you indeed. So you mentioned Sweden on purpose, and not because of Greta Thunberg, but because I am a Nordic researcher by my education at Meteorological Research too. And when I got to Sweden many years ago, I was really amazed by the environmental conscience of theirs. And traditionally, we have been underestimating this conscience. They believe that these requirements are just politics. They underestimate the change in human conscience towards the actual perception of the environment and of the climate change as something which is really needed. Politicians may be using these sentiments, but politicians are driven by human sentiments. And in their recent Christmas address, Merkel said that we need to do everything in our power to prevent ongoing change of the climate. Can I take 30 seconds of your time? And let me take an example. Fundamentally and politically, everything is okay. Economically, this is not okay. The outstanding problem with the collection and recycling of plastic garbage, which is poorly collected and which is not really recycled, whereas the hardest restrictions in the West with environmental conscience, well, they are fighting a visual picture of plastic floating in the world ocean. And this plastic, 95% of this plastic comes from 5 rivers, and 3 of which come in a flow from Africa and 2 from Asia. So these restrictions of the plastic in the open ocean does not have anything in common with Europe. This is not Europe. This is something else. I don't know whether this is enthusiasts are always enthusiasts or the sign of collusion. Look, our colleagues used a rational approach. Dmitry Borisovich, so you are a special, Sergei Borisovich is an envoy on environmental issues, the ecology and transport. These are the issues you deal with on a daily basis. I believe that lately, while the state has been paying much more attention to all this than before, conceptually. So is it all true that we've come to face these issues? Hello, first of all, hello. Hello. It's good to see so many young faces in the audience, because climate issues are something that you will come to face much harder than us. Oh, thank you. That looks promising. Of course, well, every age has advantages. Well, in actual fact, I don't really deal with climate changes because we have other people, and there is a counselor to the Russian president on climate issues. I mainly deal with the environment and transport and the ecology. Well, I don't want to boast around, but I have recently talked a lot about the environment, garbage, water, air, biodiversity in Skolkovo and elsewhere. Although I have almost never talked about climate, so I've decided I will now. I will venture to go in that direction, although this is my personal initiative, just because I love nature. Fact is that climate change has become so important in the world policies, is a fact of life. This is a fact of life that we're going to face and going to live with for ages to come. And this is not something that's going to be dispelled. This agenda is going to stay. It's a shame that there's only one researcher, one expert here, not a politician, but the research community, the scientific community, is still debating whether climatic changes are cyclical changes or caused by human impact, human interference. Because people say that 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, temperature used to change dramatically. There were some cool-off periods and some warming periods. And by the way, scientists, and I respect scientists, I listen to them, and they tend to talk about climate changes rather than the global warming. But this is a fact of life. However, we have short memory. Let's recall last summer, on last summer but one. And do you all remember snowing in the middle of July? Is it a sign of global warming or what? When I went to the Antarctic, it was some time ago though, and our researchers there, we keep testing the thickness of the ice cover in the Antarctic, and it is not depleting. It's growing, it's getting thicker, they told me. Do you see the alarmist calls about the depletion of the ozone layer above the Antarctic? But they didn't actually spot any direct impact of the ozone layer depletion on the global climate. Whereas the climate changes is recognized as a very serious threat widely, and it is only a matter of action, what kind of action we need to take.
I will tell you later on what actions are we talking about here, but in general, I think that we need to talk not only about tactical measures, first of all, related to CO2. I'm not against quotas for emissions. I understand that, and I totally agree with other speakers. I agree that sooner or later we will have to do that. And I mean, the person who pollutes has to pay for the pollution produced, and I fully agree to that. It is not subject to any discussion. But as to those quotes for emissions, I think apart from tactical measures, we need to come up with more serious solutions, and we need to come up with nature-like technologies. The technologies that would be in line with the natural processes so that we could restore the balance between the technosphere and biosphere, because obviously this balance is not in place now. Wrapping up with the political topic, well, the topic of climate is influencing the global process more and more. It is used as an argument for ban some competitors from the market. One of the leaders in terms of coming up with measures against climate change, the most active player there is the European Union, and namely Sweden. I fully agree with that direction of development, but we need to come up with our measures as well. We need to have a plan, by the way, the national plan that we already mentioned, it actually confirms that our leaders understand the importance and serious character of that problem, and they are committed to improving the situation. We already, by the way, have examples of measures of our own. You probably heard that a number of Western banks refuse to provide credit to companies that are related to carbon emissions. They say that you're a polluter, we are not going to give a loan to you. So this exists. Sometimes we see extreme measures, like, for example, in Sweden, don't take planes because you produce carbon emission. And some actually buy that idea. They even invented air shame, so they are shaming those who take planes. But in fact, comparing to military aviation, civil aviation is tiny. It is only 2% of the overall number of flights performed. Following that logic, we can refuse using cars, for example, because cars are producing much more carbon. Let's go back to cart and horses, but then again we will have emissions, but of a different kind. Anyway, the topic of climate turns or can be turned easily into a way to shape the public opinion, and I see that as well. For example, take Greta Thunberg. That is one example of that. I see that in today's environment, which can be easily manipulated, the climate agenda can be abused in order to solve political tasks and attain political goals. It will be used to discredit opponents. And, of course, that is why that topic will be used massively and often. Now, I would like to comment on my colleagues because they said lots of interesting things. In the first presentation, on one slide, I mentioned a submarine when you talked about the Arctic, and that actually made me remember one thing. Back in the Soviet times, our Navy had a unique technology of launching missiles precisely from the Northern Pole. And of course, no navigation instruments work there. But back in the Soviet times, we learned how to launch missiles from there. And that is a huge advantage in the military activity. When, in my times as a Minister of Defense, we resumed that practice, and we had veterans from the Soviet times who helped us to do that, and they told me the following. They said that, we have a technology of breaking ice and bringing submarine to the surface. Other fleets, they didn't have this technology, but when in the end of August we came to the Northern Pole, we were amazed to see no ice. And that was my original way of witnessing and getting evidence that the Arctic is melting, in fact. Now, supercomputers. We often mention the Lomonosov University supercomputer. It is not the right way to go. In Russia, the biggest and greatest supercomputers are in the nuclear centers. In Sarov, we have a great supercomputer, much better than that of the Lomonosov University, and I can only advise to the Hydromed to turn to Sarov for data processing, just for you to know that our best computer is there, and that computer is not that much behind that of other states, just for you to know. Now, what does the climate agenda mean for Russia, and what to do? We mentioned Herzen approach, Chernyshevsky approach. I will try to come up with mine. Although we are not leaders in terms of technology and combating climate change, but yet we have a number of objective advantages, and some of them are not used. We have large reserves of fresh water. We have huge reserves of fresh air, no matter how strange that sounds. And we have a lot of pure, unpolluted land that is capable of producing pure organic foods. If today we have already started exporting food more than weapon in the amount, then it is especially relevant for the Asian markets, because they have already used all their unpolluted land, and we have this potential, we have those reserves, so we need to use those reserves. Now, we, by the way, have a very good energy balance, one of the best in the world. Look, approximately 50% of our energy is produced from gas, 1/3 accounts for hydro and nuclear energy, so it means that this energy is either pure or quasi-pure, because some scientists say that even nuclear energy is polluting a bit. It produces some carbon emission, but anyway, our energy balance is very good. It is to be looked at. We are using less and less coal as the most polluting type of energy producing. We are exporting it because we shouldn't restrict our economy in terms of export, but we are consuming it less and less. Now, a new topic is an environmental dimension of the digital economy. Almost no one talks about that, but we should. Why? Because as the digitalization moves on, it consumes more and more energy, and it becomes more and more energy consuming. By 2024, we are going to use for digital processes approximately 20% of the global energy output. So as the digital economy develops on and on, we need to produce more and more energy. Otherwise, the digitalization will be disrupted. And that is a serious problem. Now, what to do? We can think of a green computer. I think that our scientists and our companies that are engaged in the green development, they should look at that opportunity, because there we will have huge competition. That who comes up with the first green computer, that person will be on the top of the hill, if I may put it so. Now, it was rightly said that today we are sitting at the avenue named after Vernadsky. Our great scientists, Vernadsky, Dokuchaev, Chiyanov, they have made a great input into the exploitation of underground reserves, underground resources. We need to think not only about cutting on the emissions of carbon and greenhouse gases. We need to think about absorption as well. Now, there is this notion of negative emission technology. We need to think seriously about that as well. Those technologies, they're capable of producing effect not in the abstract future, not in some 200 or 100 years. They will be able to significantly cut on carbon emissions in 20 years for agriculture, for example. And I was really glad to hear about agriculture in the context of climate change. And many avoid mentioning it for obvious reasons, because if you start putting pressure on agriculture, you risk of having famine. It's the same as banning cars, because of course we have engines that work on electricity or on hydrogen, but nevertheless the problem is there. And by the way, still Moscow is looking at those technologies, and we have moved forward a lot, and the traffic jams are becoming less and less frequent. By the way, traffic jams produce huge amounts of carbon. So, another thing that I didn't know, for example, the two biggest carbon emitters in the world are two industries: industrial production and agriculture. I didn't know that before lately. So we should look at these two areas. Mr. Dmitry Konov already said a lot about industrial production, and I fully agree to what he said. Indeed, we need to come up with new materials. We need to develop nature-like technologies, as I've already said. And anyway, that will be happening either voluntarily or under the pressure coming from the government and the state. That is inevitable. As to agriculture, there, of course, we need to look at new agricultural technologies. I mean, what I mean there is new breeds of plants, new breeds of animal, cattle. Because sometimes even simplest technologies like sowing land, for example, before putting seeds into the ground, that produces emission as well. Then precise agrochemistry. It is another topic to look at, and the president mentioned that in his presidential address. Another topic that Dmitry mentioned is the low rate of waste recycling. I'm actually talking a lot about it. Of course, in Russia we have not very many renewable sources of energy apart from sun and wind, but we have household waste. Household waste, we will never run out of that. The amount of waste will be only growing, and we can produce easily heat and energy out of that. So recycling waste into energy and heat, it is a new high technology industry. We need to create this one. Because I visited one waste burner in Sweden. It was opened back in 1968. Of course, it was renovated since then. It is being renovated regularly. It is located in the center of the city. It doesn't harm anyone or anything. And Sweden doesn't have to buy oil or gas. They don't have to import it because they have enough waste. Stockholm is actually heated by its own household waste, and they don't have any emissions. So I think that household waste is a new renewable source of energy. Now, forest industry. It is another important topic. By the way, when working on the Paris Agreement, along our initiative, there was a clause that was introduced into the agreement. That clause was saying that forests are a very powerful absorber of carbon. Of course, if we do not have an input into the development of those papers in some 50 years, maybe we will be criticized for having too many forests. But as of today, they are seen positively, and today they are recognized as absorbers. By the way, as of today, Russia is a global donor, both in terms of climate and ecology, because our forests, they in fact absorb more CO2 than Russia emits. So we absorb the CO2 produced by someone else. So we are donors of the planet, but it doesn't mean that we can rest on laurels and do nothing. Of course, many forests are being used by our timber industry, and we need to develop our technologies there. I'm not going to go deep into the details and talk about the national systems of environmental control. I can only say that we have to come up with our own monitoring system. We cannot play along someone else's rules. And last but not least, the climate agenda should be made a national priority, an overall national priority, not a priority only in terms of the environmental agenda and environmental topic. And I think we are moving that way, and we are doing it rightly. That is it from me. Thank you. Thank you very much. While listening to you, I thought of one bizarre thing. Maybe it is not directly related to what you said, but nevertheless, it is in line with the idea that we do have our own traditions, but unfortunately we don't use them. And I now remember one TV program that I was watching back in the 70s, and Mr. Maltif was saying about new tilling methods, and that was a big innovation at the time, and that is precisely what you were mentioning. It was back in the 70s, but then it wasn't used. There was another episode, it was back in the times of the Cold War, and there was a sensational, famous exhibition in Moscow. It was an American exhibition in Nixon times, and in the US there is a well-known episode when Gorbachev had an exchange with Nixon. There was a regular American kitchen presented there, and Nixon showed him, just look at how a typical American is living, and Khrushchev started criticizing a dishwashing machine. In fact, Khrushchev said that you don't need that because you are polluting water, and so on and so forth. And if we look at that conversation from today's point of view, we will see that, in fact, Khrushchev was a prophet and Nixon was, well, he was to be criticized.
So we're coming to an end of this discussion. And I would like to reiterate that, well, this panel was inspired by Andrei Fursenko. So you are entitled to the final remarks, because we are kind of drawing the line in the sense that we are going to keep on with that after this discussion is over. Okay, no, I cannot actually draw the line here. It was so interesting, and I kept making notes. Well, this topic has been exhausted by and large. I just wanted to add a couple of brief comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
First,
Concluding
in actual fact, we are talking about more than this country, but it is just common practice to be looking for the guilty, to identify the guilty, or appoint the guilty parties if you can't find them. And, well, we have a lot of chances of being appointed the guilty or turning out to be the guilty party. So if we do not want to be scapegoats once again, so what Sergei Borisovich and Nikolai Dmitrievich said, we need to have our own system in place, our own outlook in place. This won't come cheap. But that is indispensable for the economy as a whole, for the political sphere as a whole, for the social tranquility of the country as a whole. And one other thing is that we need to have our own system in place and computer facilities in place. This is indispensable. Let me put it that way. Like meals, computer and technology has a downside as well as an upside. The more food we produce, so we have been talking more about manufacturers rather than consumers. The energy producers are to blame, the materials producers are to blame, the farming sector is to blame because they are producing too much, the transport sector is to blame. Oh, by the by, transport is both producing and consuming. And this is probably the only consumer that is to blame. That is the transport vehicles. Although transport produces 4 to 5% of the total carbon footprint, and the entire food chain will account for about 40% of the total carbon dioxide emissions, if it comes to that. Well, there is a phrase which is attributed either to Vishnevsky or Plisetsky that eat less when asked how to slim. So I'm not sure that it'll do us a lot of good if we just start eating less. Not in Africa. I don't think Africa will listen to that, will understand that, because their situation is somewhat different. Well, there is one other side of consumption, which is digital economy. Sergei Ivanov here was very modest. There are some other statistics, and say up to 30% consumed by the digital economy, and at least 50% of the energy produced will be consumed by the digital appliances. Interesting as it is, 90% of all information and data was obtained and processed, stored and protected are never used. 90% never used. However, unlike transport, It would be very interesting to identify a politician who would venture to say, let's put on restrictions on transport. That would be even worse than saying, let's limit production of foodstuffs. This is so undemocratic, uncontemporary. And still, we have to realize one thing, that this is one of the main sources of climate change. I believe that in the coming decade or so, it will become the main source of climate change, the main reason of climate change. This is a totally unfashionable, it's an untrendy topic, because those people who advocate alternative energy contribute very little in practical terms. I don't think that this is something that will change our energy balance. It will not. And this topic will change the whole picture. So, of course, we can say, so why don't you raise energy prices? And by doing so, you will limit consumption. Raise prices. Raise the prices for IT resources. In doing so, you will impede the actual use of IT resources, but it would be very interesting for me to see any politician here or in Europe or in America who will take the responsibility of offering that. Why don't we raise our taxes for the usage of digital resources? Why don't we raise fees for IT and digital resources? I'm not sure they will last long, those who will venture that. And when it comes to the green computer, that would be a radical solution, although energy will still be consumed. As soon as new opportunities pop up, then immediately consumption will grow. At the same time, I do not want to limit consumption by fiat. I believe that we need to use an across-the-board approach to challenges at hand. I think we need to use across-the-board approaches and to name names properly. If we increase costs, then we have to say that this is more than just a benefit, but this is also a cost and a problem. And this applies to all aspects of the climate change problem. And Fyodor and Sergei and everyone else mentioned that in their remarks. We do not want to join the alarmist choir. We need to know, to find out how we can get adapted to that. And we need to draw our lessons from that, both positive and negative. And we also need to identify the direct or indirect consumers of the warming effect. Well, people are saying that we no longer have 4 seasons, we're going to have 2, what is called like winter and autumn. Look, my generation is used to living with 4 seasons. Well, occasionally we might still have snow around. That would be a good thing. Personally, I vote for autumn, particularly when it comes as what they call the golden autumn, the Indian summer as it goes. Well, springtime politically has received some strange connotations over the past couple of decades. I believe that this has been a very good and diverse mixed discussion together with Oleg Kordin. And thanks to Andrei Fursenko's support, we undertake not to drop this topic, because there are so many ramifications for this sphere. And particularly when Sergei Ivanov talked about the submariners who surfaced and found no ice around. Well, this is the politics stemming from the 19th century, which has a lot of drawbacks, but still based on several fundamentals, marine fundamentals and land fundamentals. If we follow up on what's going up with the classical continental power, well, we may turn into classical marine power. And that would mean monumental change in self-perception, self-identification. It is not a matter of good and bad. Like was said, it is a matter of adaptation, because we'll have to. Thank you so much. See you at the next forum.
Представительный, да?
I want to apologize. Please give me 1 minute. The low road. I come from the Russian Union of Builders, Construction Union. But I have a lot of respect for powers that be and for the highbrow people. And I want to mention several solutions for the environmental area that was developed, a model which was developed within this academy, something that will expedite the actual warming of buildings. And this will help resolve some environmental issues and will improve the social stability in the country. And using the words of our president, there are 2 billion square meters of floor space. 1 billion of that needs to be renovated as quickly as possible. Facade renovation is one thing. And we're talking about 12 trillion rubles. Well, small and medium businesses, I'm sorry, did you want to ask a question? Well, there is a model which was developed jointly with the Plekhanov University and the Academy and several others. So we will submit our proposal to you. Can you consider that? Okay.